Please welcome to The Late Show, Julia Ioffe. Hello, Julia
Ioffe. Everything they do, is that a Putin thing or is that a Russian thing?
It's kind of a Russian thing.
Is this like a cultural thing?
You know, that fear, that discomfort, that they were clearly dancing bears performing for their master who is impossible to please.
Welcome here to Wavemaker Conversations, and Julia Ioffe, thank you so much for joining us here in Nantucket.
Thank you for having me. It's beautiful out here. I've never been.
The first thing I want to do is we want to get to the hard news very fast, because obviously Ukraine has launched this surprise offensive in Russian territory. What do you know about that? And how would you anticipate Putin's next move?
Well, what we know so far is they're on day 3, I believe. The Ukrainian military is on about day 3 of a surprise attack into the Kursk region in southwestern Russia, so across the border. They're still occupying some Russian territory, which is extraordinary. They have taken a bunch of prisoners, including border guards, kind of territorial, kind of National Guard type people. Lots of people are fleeing. Putin has authorized a small payout to those who have had to flee. But what's extraordinary is that this is happening about a year and change after Yevgeny Prigozhin's surprise march on Moscow, right? That happened in June of last year. And
just remind everybody the head of, because the way you pronounce it is the real pronunciation, the head of the Wagner.
Yeah,
Wagner.
Yes, the head of the Wagner mercenary group, who had been expressing his frustrations for months with the then defense minister of Russia, and said, you know, if we don't get justice, then we will march on Moscow. It will be our march of fairness. And he went and did it in June of last year. And that time, like this time, it was like a hot knife through butter. He took a major city, Rostov, which was in southern Russia, or Rostov, if you want to understand what I'm saying, which was basically the hub of the southern. It was the Southern Military Command, Russian Military Command, right? It's where the war was essentially run out of. He took it without firing a shot. And right now we see, again, Ukrainians going into Russia proper, not just shooting rockets, not just shooting drones, but going into Russian territory, not Crimea, but like actual Russia, like a hot knife through butter. And I saw somebody joke about this, that, you know, Prigozhin walked so the Ukrainians could run. You know? But it just shows that, you know, a lot of this, it's kind of like what we saw in February of 2022 when Russia invaded, and everybody was talking about how Russia was the second biggest, most formidable, most sophisticated military in the world, and we saw that they were in fact a paper tiger. They could do a lot of damage, but they couldn't do shit in terms of actually fulfilling their military objectives, which was seizing Kiev really fast, right? And here you have, as soon as you get away from the front lines, you see that the Russian heartland isn't really protected, and even more so that they haven't done anything to reinforce it since Prigozhin's incursion, march on Moscow, right? He got really far into Russia, and nobody really fired a shot at him.
So you talk about a knife through hot butter, though. We know
hot knife through butter.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
But I think hot butter would make it easy, too.
Well, you know what? However, Prigozhin is no longer with us, and so maybe the butter froze. I don't know, but you know, what is going to happen? I mean, is Putin in trouble just based on what we know from the past few days? It seems like he bounces back from everything and he's still in control, but what would it take? What would it take to get him into trouble in terms of his hold on power?
I think for the latter to happen, I think some kind of prolonged, intense economic crisis, and not the kind of economic crisis that Americans would consider an economic crisis, where, our inflation goes up a little bit, our gas prices go up a little bit, we freak out and we say, throw the bums out, and everybody's approval goes through the floor. There's a guy I talked to in Moscow who's very close to the Kremlin, used to be in the Kremlin, and he once put it to me this way, and I've heard this expressed over the years by many Russians, but they're suffering, their kind of standard of suffering is much, much higher, their threshold, as it were. And he was like, look, okay, prices are a little higher, inflation's a little higher because of the war. We don't have mass starvation, we don't have famine, people aren't being rounded up by the millions, so we're fine. Right.
That's literally the standard, like sort of from Stalin times.
Yeah, and I think that there's a reason, for example, that Vladimir Putin has basically made a cult, a religion out of World War II, and why Russians will intone and invoke and intone the figure of 27 million. 27 million is how many people the Soviet Union lost in World War II. I mean, they literally just drowned Hitler with Soviet corpses, right? Russia lost 15% of its population in 4 years and called it a victory. And now, so now we hear various figures of Russian casualties from this war. Some Russian independent journalists have confirmed at least 60,000 dead. We're hearing in other quarters 300,000 killed and wounded in action. It's not even close to 27 million, so.
Well, that phrase you just, they drowned the enemy in Russian corpses, and do you think, are they prepared to do that now? I mean, it still doesn't seem like it is the kind of system that Stalin had in terms of total control of every nook and cranny of society. So what's the limit now?
Here's the thing, the purges of the Stalin era, the Great Terror, World War II, it's still doing its work now, right? Putin doesn't have to do what Stalin did. He doesn't have to do what Stalin did, where during the Great Terror, he basically had about 1 million Soviets executed, about 20 million Soviets went through the Gulag. At the height of the terror, there were about 2,200 arrests per day and 1,000 executions per day for about a year. That was at the height, right? That and the war touched every single Soviet family and every single Russian family. Russia was obviously part of the Soviet Union. And that trauma has been passed, and that memory has been passed down generation to generation. So Putin, when he comes in, he doesn't have to arrest everybody. He can arrest a few people, and everybody very quickly gets the message. I mean, one of the surprises of the last 2.5 years for me, for my family, for other Russia watchers, was just how quickly that memory was activated in Russians. That fear and that knowing of that's it. Keep your head down. Don't say anything, even if you don't agree. My friend Nina Khrushcheva, who you should have up here, who's both the granddaughter and the great-granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev. Complicated story. She, adoption, essentially. He adopted, Nikita Khrushchev and his wife adopted their biological granddaughter. So then, anyway. So she was saying, and she's back in Russia now. She's been going back despite the danger, hoping that her last name protects her. And she was saying, what's fascinating is not just how quickly people remembered how to be Soviet and to be quiet and to be afraid and to not stick their heads out, but how quickly people remembered it who weren't even alive during the Soviet Union. Right? Like even the young people are just like, yep, got it.
You know what it reminds me of? Tim Snyder, the Ukraine expert, the great. Do people here know Tim Snyder, the Russia-Ukraine expert? And he wrote a book called On Tyranny. And one of the 20 lessons, just 20 lessons he took out of the tyrannies of the 20th century was do not obey in advance. but it seems, from what you're saying, that the Russians are, in a sense, trained to obey in advance.
Well, because it's a painful and dangerous lesson that they all know too well. They know that if you don't obey in advance, really bad things will happen to you. For example, a childhood friend of mine, her father and my father went to college together. They're still best friends. She and I grew up together. She now lives in St. Petersburg. Hates Putin, used to go to Navalny protests and opposition protests, and thought about leaving the country when the war broke out, and ultimately stayed with her husband and 2 kids. And when the draft started, the quote-unquote partial mobilization in the fall of 2022, she and I were talking, and I said, do you know anybody, how do you feel about the draft? Do you know anybody who's been drafted? And her husband is really high up at Gazprom, the state gas monopoly. And she's like, well, they'll never take my husband, so I don't really care. And my son is too young, so I don't really care about the draft. And I was like, wow, that is pretty fucking heartless and selfish. And she was like, okay, well, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? You want me to go out in the street with an anti-war poster? I won't even get to unfurl it. They'll arrest me before I even get to open it. They'll throw me in jail. I'll get a 10-year sentence. I won't see my kids. I won't see my husband. I will never be able to work again. And it won't change anything. It won't stop the war. It won't change the way Putin makes decisions. So what do you want? And what is the point, right? And so, I think that there's a lot of people like her in Russia.
And some of your most, by the way, we should tell everyone, if you didn't read her bio in the ticketing, Julia grew up in Moscow, left with her family at age 7. Why don't you share just why your parents left with you?
Okay, yeah, that would be bad if they left without me. Although, yeah. We left in 1990 as part of that wave of Soviet Jews who left, and we were refugees. We were the Jackson-Vanik Jews, which Jackson-Vanik was an amendment passed in the U.S. Congress in 1974 to deny the Soviet Union favored trade status because of the systemic state discrimination of Jews in the Soviet Union. That discrimination was very real. It's on my birth certificate, my nationality is on my birth certificate. Rather, my parents' nationalities are on my birth certificate as Jewish and Jewish, even though they were both born in Moscow. So people will sometimes say, oh, you're Russian. I'm like, no, I'm not Russian, I'm Jewish. No, and people are like, but you're from Russia. And I'm like, yeah, but literally nobody in Russia would ever call me Russian. And in fact, they'd probably correct me. But that meant you couldn't go to most universities, you couldn't have a lot of the sensitive jobs, you couldn't really travel abroad, just a lot of everyday kind of quotidian discrimination, but very much kind of second-class citizen status. And the U.S. very deftly exploited this during the Cold War as part of its pushing on the Soviet Union on human rights abuses. And that's basically why my family got out, because there was political will in Washington to use this issue against their number one geopolitical enemy or foe, right? Which unfortunately a lot of other refugees around the world do not have. They do not have that will, that bipartisan political will in Washington. But that's why we came here.
Two things that occur to me right there. You talk about, again, Jackson-Vanik was economic pressure. Our response to Ukraine was economic plus military pressure without our direct involvement. And reading some of your work, our pressure...
By the way,
yes.
If anybody wants to read about that history, there's a phenomenal book called When They Come For Us, We'll Be Gone by Gal Beckerman, who's now at The Atlantic. It is a big fat tome, but I tore through it in a couple days. I learned a lot about my own family history, why it happened. I learned my parents didn't know. They were kind of, little people caught up in this bigger process. But it was fascinating, as was the descriptions in the book about how much American Jewry contributed to that pressure, kept up that pressure on Washington because of their guilt for not having done enough during the Holocaust. So it's a fascinating, amazing book called When They Come For Us, We'll Be Gone by Gul Beckerman. Cannot recommend it highly enough.
It's so interesting because we started with breaking news, and you keep on bringing it back to the history. So let me bring it all the way back, because you have done one of the most fascinating podcast series I've ever heard. It's called About a Boy, and it's all about Putin's childhood, and you were talking about Stalin and the memory. There it is. Fantastic. But somebody earlier today, as they were walking in, said, he looked so innocent then. And I said, well, well, maybe that's your, I would say Russian eyes, but I guess
I would say those eyes are just so conniving and
Okay.
I wouldn't trust that kid.
You're not projecting backwards?
No,
okay.
no.
Okay. You're tough.
Oh yeah.
Wow. Well, going back, it's, again, you don't just learn about Vladimir Putin the boy, although you learn a lot about him. You learn about everything that was going on. In fact, you spoke to your father for this podcast, who has, and I can hear his sense of humor through that podcast. So maybe we'll get into some Russian humor soon, because I want to be able to tell some Russian jokes when we get out of here. But your father quoted a German saying, and the German saying is, in every person you can see their childhood home, which really got me. And that was the launching point for this. So tell us, what should we know about Putin's childhood and everything that was going on around it?
Yeah. So the podcast actually started with, to really go back, like 15 years when I moved 15 years ago when I moved to Moscow on a Fulbright, and then I was going to stay 3 months and stayed 3 years instead, and it became
Can I rewind it a little bit just to give people the background? So you ended up going to Princeton, majored in Russian studies?
Soviet history. My parents were like, you're joking, right? I mean, my parents were, my mom was still in the course of her retraining. She had been a physician in the Soviet Union. She was an ENT back there. She had to retrain when she came here. She became a surgical pathologist here. We had $0 for a very long time, and I got into Princeton, and my parents were like, well, according to this ranking in this very important sounding newspaper, U.S. News and World Report, it's #1, so she has to go. And they took out loans, and really $0. And then I get there, and I'm like, I start as pre-med. I'm going to be the 4th generation woman doctor in my family. My mom, my grandma, my great-grandmothers were all doctors. And then I take this class on Soviet history, taught by Stephen Kotkin, who is an absolute legend. He's now at Stanford. And I'm like, I think, screw it. I'm not going to be a doctor. I think I want to get a PhD in Soviet history. And my parents were like, we should have left you behind, like, what are you doing? And I'm like, and I had this very American, very waspy boyfriend at the time, Charlie, whose, mother's family came over on the Mayflower. And I was like, well, Charlie gets to be a theater major. And my dad's like, it's his country. He can do that. You can't do this shit to us. Anyway, so how do we get on that?
Well, because I wanted people to know, like, where you were coming from.
Yeah.
And
so and then I was gonna.
So it started. So you went back to. So just to tell people, you went. We always get back on the train.
Thank
it
you.
just might take a long time, but don't worry about it. So you go to Princeton. You major in Soviet studies, and then you get a Fulbright to go back to Russia as a reporter. And I have to say,
which comes as a kind of culmination of 4 years of me very painfully coming out of the closet as a journalist, which agreed my parents to no end. Because I was all right. I wasn't going to be a doctor, so I could at least be a lawyer, right? And no, I was like, no, I want to write. I want to be a journalist. And they were like, why? What have we ever done to you? So, but now they're, and actually my sister, who is a doctor, hopefully you will never need her services. She's an oncologist at Fox Chase in Philly. We're very, just nachas machine. She remembers a story. She went to my mom's medical school where my mom teaches, and somebody said to my mom, it's like, oh, you're Julia Ioffe's mom. You must be so proud. And my mom said, define proud.
That's funny.
Anyway, so then I went to Russia in 2009.
And I just want to tell people, like, if you just look up Julia Ioffe, you wrote for Foreign Policy magazine, you wrote for The New Yorker, your dispatches were amazing. I just got absorbed one dispatch after another, exquisitely written, and still so relevant. Like, it actually helped me understand what is going on today. And by the way, you tell me what you want to about that time in Russia, but it seems like there was an opposition. You were in the middle of big demonstrations, and those demonstrators weren't necessarily thinking about Stalin's legacy.
Yeah, I mean, there was a real opposition. I remember in December of 2010, I went to go meet a hot new blogger named Alexey Navalny in a cafe in Moscow for lunch. And I was freelancing at the time, and I thought I would just do a quick blog post for Business Week or Forbes or something, because he was doing this whole, he was trained as a lawyer. His whole thing was corruption in state companies at the time. And he bought up shares in like Aeroflot and Transneft, which is the big monopoly for transporting oil out of the country. And he would buy a few shares in each and then become an activist minority shareholder and use that position to uncover all this malfeasance, corporate malfeasance in these state companies. And I was like, okay, I'll write, a short little thing about him for one of the business publications I write for occasionally. And I went and met with him, and I just remember feeling like this is what it must have been like to be in the room with a young Bill Clinton or a young Barack Obama. I mean, the charisma, the force of personality, just like you talk to him for 10 minutes and you want to follow him into battle. You believe everything he's telling you. Young, energetic, brilliant, funny. And I remember I went home that day and I emailed David Remnick and I said, I think we have to do a profile of this guy. And that was, winter of 2010, 2011. And sadly, we know how that story ended. But he was real. He was real. And he led a lot of people into, people went to jail for him.
And some of those people were just released, and you just wrote a piece on what comes after that prisoner release, and it was really striking, your description of the people who were now let out of prison, who were his deputies.
Some of them
were. But you're not as optimistic about them, because he was just a unique... you probably all had the same reaction. When he was poisoned and then decided, I'm going back to Russia, it's like we were all reaching out, right, and wants to pull him back in a sense. Don't go, but no, not you, and not his fellow opposition members. And explain that to us.
I think some opposition members question that decision. His family did not question it. He did not question it. And the reason is very simple. Russians, and I think like Americans, they don't accept leadership from abroad. If you had, I don't even know how to say, imagine we lived in a dictatorship and the opposition leader was living in France and telling you all to rise up and go into the streets and risk your lives and your families and your livelihoods while this guy is sitting comfortably in France. You wouldn't do it. And you would also say, not only would you not do it, you would also question the kind of audacity of him calling on you to do that. And B, you would say, you don't even know what it's like here. You don't know what it's like to live and work and raise a family under these conditions, etc. So exile, as Vladimir Putin learned in the 70s, I would say, 60s, 70s, 80s, while coming up in the KGB, he learned that exile was one of the most potent weapons that the KGB had. They used to kill their political enemies in the 30s and 40s and 20s, but then they just throw them out of the country. And they immediately lose all their relevance. And Navalny knew that. We saw it with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was the head of Yukos. He was the oil magnate who was jailed in 2003. And then Putin released him as part of an amnesty at the end of 2013. He served a decade in jail. And when he sat in jail, he wrote articles, he gave kind of written interviews. And every time a letter from him came out from jail, everybody would stop and read it. It carried a lot of moral weight. This man was living in horrific conditions in a penal colony, first near a uranium mine in Siberia, then past the Arctic Circle, where Alexei ended up. And it carried weight, because not only was he asking people to do things that he was going to do, he was suffering more than everybody else. And also Russians, Russian Orthodox Christianity, even if people don't go to church as much as Americans do, that culture is so deeply enmeshed, even after 70 years of communism. It's so in the culture that, that suffering makes you better, that suffering is important, that suffering is a form of information. And the fact that, he was in jail and suffering ostensibly for a better Russia, a better future for other Russians, gave his words weight. And then when he was amnestied, when Putin amnestied him on the eve of the 2014 Olympics, sent him right out of the country, and he lost all his relevance overnight. And he's been trying in the 10 years since to build, with the money he has left over, which is plenty, a journalistic organization, a political organization, and it's all just, and actually just in this prisoner release, Ilya Yashin, who was one of the, opposition activists who was traded out, he said he was one of the several people who was traded out who said, I didn't want to be exchanged, and I asked for my name to be removed from any lists. I didn't want. He's like, I stayed, I came back to Russia after the war, I stayed, I took the risk knowingly, and I didn't want to be on the list. And in his very first interview after the prisoner exchange, he said, when I was in jail, I knew that my words had weight. When I spoke out against the war, when I spoke out about corruption and political repressions, my words had weight. And now that I'm abroad, they have no weight at all. He knows it. They all know, and that's why Putin did it. And in fact, that people now speculate, and I think they're probably right, that Putin or the Kremlin put these names on the list, right, to just expel them. Even though it's against the Russian Constitution, you can't just take a citizen and deport them. But yeah, that they know, that's why he went back, because
The story reminds me of Sharansky refusing to be released for many, many years because he didn't want to confess. What was the reason again? He just refused. I can't remember the reason. But let us go back to Putin the boy, because I really do want to get to that.
So basically, when I moved to Moscow in 2009, I had studied Soviet history. I had read up on contemporary Russian stuff. But every time I would talk to my dad back home in Maryland, he would be like, oh, well, when he said this, he meant that. Or when you see this little gesture in a meeting with this other guy, that's what that means. Or this little word he used, that's actually, what that really means is, it comes from this word, but it really means this. And I realized how very quickly that, because they came from similar upbringings. My dad grew up in a suburb of Moscow, very, very blue collar, kind of rough. And he ran around the schoolyard with boys like Putin. And he referred to him, he would often say, I grew up with people like him. I could see right through this fucker. And he, I'm sorry, I have a very
Can you,
mouth,
just in the future, can you say that in Russian instead? How would you say
There's
that in
so
Russian?
many different words for
Is that right?
Russian. It's okay.
Just so we can hear
Russian mat, Russian cursing, is a whole language unto itself, essentially. And because Russian is, it's like a combination lock in terms of how you form words, kind of like German, where you have a root and then you can have a preposition, an ending, and a suffix, and you can just change them all up. You can have basically infinite combinations. And my grandmother, who I lived with in Moscow, her neighbor and friend, who was a linguist and an Arabist, was the co-editor of a dictionary of, what was it called? Non-standard lexicon, meaning cursing. It was this thick. It was this thick, and you open it up to a random page and you lose your mind laughing. It was like dick and tomato sauce. I'm like, what does that mean? Like, yeah.
So say some of these things. Can you give us a few examples in Russian and then translate for us? Because does everybody agree that would be really valuable moving forward? Okay, because we're looking for actionable intelligence. I mean, there's one thing.
So I mentioned my sister was the Nachas machine. I'm the opposite of that. I'm up here like teaching you cursing, Russian cursing, There's an amazing Instagram account called Curse Like a Russian, where they tell you what it really means and also the kind of literal translation. And my favorite of them is, and they do these little doodles to illustrate them, and one of them is "И понеслась пизда по кочкам," which means like everything's going to shit very quickly. And their literal translation is, and off the cunt went hopping from hill to hill.
I shouldn't have asked you for the translation. It was a mistake.
Yeah. Anyway, but yes, that's where the podcast comes from, is like consulting with my dad, who was this kind of cultural anthropological translator. And as we got into making the podcast, a lot of which drew on research I did for my book, which is coming out next spring, I realized it was just kind of a sociology and anthropology of the Soviet boomers, who are so different from American boomers, from their American counterparts, who are optimistic, who demand that tomorrow be better than today, that their kids are better off than they were. They always want a silver lining. They're just like a rich and optimistic generation. And the Soviet boomers are the absolute opposite of that, especially those like Putin, who kind of grew up in the streets, like a lot of them did. But
you say grow up in the streets, like what literally, what lessons did he learn in the streets? Or I remember the term, you said the dvor, which is like the playground.
Well, the dvor is like, it's like a courtyard. It's because either you were growing up like Putin in the center of an old, beautiful historical city, and the buildings kind of formed a natural courtyard, or you grew up in these kind of new suburbs like my dad, where the new construction, post-war construction, created these kind of urban courtyards where all of life played out. That's where the playground was. That's where the babushki would sit and eat sunflower seeds and gossip. It's where the kind of boys would form little mini gangs and have turf wars. And yeah, that's where.
How did that shape him? I mean,
massively. It's shaped everybody of that generation.
So in that sense, he's not that different from
no,
everybody
he's
else.
not. And again, and I realized in making this and in writing about it and making the podcast is that Russians and most Soviets, they see Putin and they immediately get it. They see the background, they see the cultural code, because he plays it up. And now this kind of swaggering, kind of street urchin, hoodlum, and the people around him, his ministers, even those that come from really elite backgrounds, like his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, who came from a kind of elite Soviet diplomatic family, they now ape his behavior, they mimic his vocabulary, they try to sound like these hoodlums. And anybody from the Soviet era or from Russia immediately gets it, but Americans have no way to know. And this was why we made it, which is like, here's what this culture is, here's how it informs Putin, and the rules are very simple. Like a very close friend of mine who's from Lagos, Nigeria, was like, oh, he's an area boy. We have those too. They just don't become president in Nigeria. But it's like might makes right. Physical power is the most important thing, and it's the only way to change up a social hierarchy. If you promise something or if you say you're going to do something, you have to do it. Otherwise, you're showing weakness. And if you show weakness, you're dead.
Is that why maybe we don't hear Putin himself come out today when his forces are sort of in bad shape from this offensive? Is that why we don't hear him react immediately, because he doesn't want to say something? I mean, he did the same thing with Prigozhin.
That's a good point. Yeah, he, in general, in times of unprecedented crisis, kind of like Stalin, he hangs back a little bit, and he, I think, sometimes panics and doesn't know what to do. He's usually the one who's unpredictable, who does that to other people. But in situations like this, he's kind of on the back foot. He's thrown off, and he doesn't want to show any of that weakness. He doesn't want to let anybody smell any blood in the water. He will kind of regroup quietly and then react on his own timeline.
So you just painted that picture. Paul, can we run the short excerpt from the Frontline documentary? So Julia was a main voice in this Road to War documentary, and it sort of begins a long time ago, but this is a 2-minute excerpt we're going to show you. It's a meeting 3 days before Russia invaded Ukraine.
Vladimir Putin is about to chair a meeting of the Russian Security Council.
Vladimir Putin will address his Security Council at a special session.
It was 3 days before Vladimir Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine.
Итак, кадры из Кремля прямо сейчас.
You have him striding his sort of cocky walk and sitting by himself. And his advisors, they're literally sitting like 30 feet away from Putin.
They're sitting in an array like school children. This looked more like something you would see in a royal court than you would see in a modern government.
Слово каждому из вас. Но в конечном итоге мы должны с вами решить, что мы дальше будем делать и как мы должны поступать.
It was unhinged. Having his national security team one by one press him to invade Ukraine.
У нас нет границы с Украиной. Это граница американцев, потому что они хозяева в этой стране.
They went up there and dutifully said what the master wanted them to say.
Я считаю, что нам не оставили выбора, поэтому я однозначно говорю да.
I think back to that Security Council meeting and I realize how scared they must all be of him. It just felt like they were dancing bears performing for their master who is impossible to please.
What was especially weird and creepy was the way he dressed down the head of his foreign intelligence service, Naryshkin. Naryshkin was sweating. He was stammering.
В противном случае мы должны принять то решение, о котором сегодня говорится. Что значит, в противном случае вы предлагаете начать переговорный процесс? Нет, я... Или признавать суверенитет. А я говорите прямо. Я поддержу предложение о признании. Поддержу или поддерживаю? Говорите прямо, Сергей. Поддерживаю предложение. Так и скажите, да или нет. Да. Я поддерживаю предложение о признании независимости. Хорошо, пожалуйста, садитесь. Спасибо. Владимир Александрович.
Pretty amazing. So, Julia, I mean, that's what you're talking about. In fact, keep that picture up, because some of the people you were talking about, there's Lavrov over on the right, but who do you want to point us to, who might enlighten us in terms of what the situation is now? Are all these people still with him?
They've been rotated around. So Putin, this is another thing from the Dvor, is the team you have, the guys you're rolling with, you can't fire them. They're not gonna, you can fire Sergei, but his family's still gonna live, 2 floors up from you. Can't get rid of him. So you just rotate them around. You gotta work with who you have, especially if they're loyal to you. So he just rotates them around. It's like musical chairs. So we have Shoigu, who was then the defense minister.
He's the second from right?
Yeah. And he was just rotated out after Putin's inauguration for his 57th term in office. And he is now the secretary of the National Security Council. Next to him is, God, what is his name? I have the wrong name in my head, but he was the secretary of the National Security Council, Patrushev. who was very close to him, was also an old KGB hand. And he had been basically, before Putin's last election, he had been pushing Putin to promote his son. So a lot of these guys have children who are adults, who are about my age or a little older, a little younger, and they all now have senior roles in government or in these state corporations, and their daddies are pushing them up high, and you know, lobbying Putin to promote them here and there. Patrushev, who was very close to Putin, is even more hawkish, even more paranoid, even more crazy than Putin. I mean, he makes Putin look like a moderate. He kept pushing...
Which one is he?
The one in the purple tie. Yeah, the one in the front row.
Gotcha.
You see in the kind of purple tie?
Oh, purple, so the middle.
Yeah.
Because I want to know who to avoid when I...
I would say all of them.
Okay.
And yeah, so he kept pushing Putin to promote his son to be prime minister if he were to win. So, and Putin was like, I think appropriately felt that, you know, Patrushev was getting a little too big for his britches and demoted him actually, and gave him like this weird post that was like, you're now in charge of shipbuilding. But he did promote his son, but not to prime minister. But it was a kind of like, you pushed a little too hard, friend.
And by the way, you mentioned, we were talking earlier about the economic pressure. You wrote another piece. I don't know if this was your piece sort of looking at Putin's the fifth inauguration. And what we learned from that, and then I want to open it up to questions, from that fifth inauguration, based on your interpretation, this didn't happen overnight. Putin was not the sort of dictator we know today when he first came in. Tell us just quickly about that evolution. How did he get to this point where we could see him publicly dressing down that poor, stammering senior official?
Who was, by the way, there to meet the Russian spies who were released. He was there on the tarmac, Naryshkin, so he survived. I mean, he started almost as soon as he came into office, and one of the first things and it was documented brilliantly by my friend and former boss Susan Glasser, who's I think a lot of you know from Nantucket, who was just in this documentary as well. So she and Peter Baker wrote this amazing book. They were correspondents in Russia from 2000 to 2005 for the Washington Post. They wrote an amazing book, very kind of ahead of the curve, called Kremlin Rising, and it documents those first 5 years of Putin in the Kremlin and how he almost immediately just starts taking steps. One of the first things he did, which is why when Donald Trump went after SNL as president, it was just like alarm bells went off immediately, because one of the first things that Putin did was he went after this satirical show called Kukly, Dolls, on NTV, which was this very outspoken, liberal, democratic channel, and there was a doll that looked like him, made fun of him, emphasized his small stature, which would have been a massive liability in the courtyard on the streets, and he went after them immediately. He went after he took over their channel immediately. He took over the media first. He started going after elections. It was basically, you know, slowly boiling a frog. But it didn't happen immediately. It almost never does, which is why a lot of us who had spent years studying Russia, covering Russia, or other authoritarian regimes, when Donald Trump came into office, we were like, does this horn honk any louder? Like, nobody's listening to us. This is how it starts.
One last question, and then I really do want to open it up. I was in a meeting with a senator years ago. This was during the Obama administration. He was well-known in the foreign policy sphere, and he said, we make a mistake if we demonize Putin. And that goes for a lot of other people. And at the same time, there's a very famous conflict resolution guy named Bill Urey who wrote the book Getting to Yes. And he's been called in, you know, in a lot of conflict zones. And Urey had an exercise with the president's brother of Colombia. He helped negotiate the end of the Civil War, and he said, here's what I want you to do. Write the victory speech of your enemy, of the FARC guerrillas. decide what you can give up, what you can't give up, and then write the speech that that person has to give to his people so that they feel it was worth the battle. Is there something you can think of with Putin in terms of the Ukraine war ending in a way that serves Ukraine's interests and helps Putin save face?
I mean, the thing is, Putin could stop the war at any minute and sell it to his population as a victory. He has total control, or near total control of the informational space. He has now gotten, he's become very good at shutting down even the kind of the little trickles of independent information that get out. And he's convinced most of his population of the lie that this is a war that's existential for Russia. It's not at all existential for Russia. It could stop tomorrow and Russia would be fine. Russia's doing great now. I mean, they're really profiting off the war. Everybody I talk to in Russia is like, there's never been this much money.
So here we tried to put all this economic pressure on them, and you've written about this.
Yeah.
Their economy is smooth sailing.
It's booming. It's booming. And so he could sell it to them, but the problem is that it's existential for him. If he loses this war, he is weak. He will be susceptible to a power grab internally. And so he has convinced everybody in Russia that it is existential for them too. And I think that he could sell any compromise, anything he gets at the negotiating table as a win to the Russian people. But I don't think he would stop. We saw what the intervening 8 years were between the illegal annexation of Crimea and the invasion of the Donbass, the eastern Ukraine. Or like it was a quote unquote frozen conflict, but 15,000 people were killed in those 8 years, and then he relaunched. I think he would continue doing that because it's not about NATO, it's not about the West, it's about the fact that he sees Ukraine as integral to this empire that he's reconstructing. There was an amazing moment very early in the war, like 3 days into this full-scale invasion. Ukrainians, by the way, will always correct you and say, the war didn't start in 2022, it started in 2014, and they're right. But when the full-scale invasion started, 3 days into the war, this article briefly went up on one of the state news agency websites, and it said, "Yay, we won. We've conquered Kiev, we just had this amazing parade in Kiev, and now we can do what we've always been planning to do." And it was written by some guy that a lot of people hadn't heard of. And we can now start the process or continue the process of building this country that is Russia at the center, and the Russians are the great Russians, they would be at the center, with the little Russians in Ukraine and the white Russians in Belarus. And we can all be this one big Slavic ethno-state with Moscow as the center. And everybody was like, sorry, what? And they quickly took it down. Right, but it was clear that this was part of the kind of information war that was being waged, and that they just posted too soon. But that's what they had planned, and it didn't really mention NATO. It was like, oh, the West doesn't want us to do this, but what they wanted to do wasn't to necessarily to roll back NATO, was to build this weird Slavic ethno-state, and I don't think in the summer before the invasion, Putin wrote this long, insane kind of pseudo-history about how Ukraine had always belonged to Russia, was always part of Russia, that it wasn't a real country. He's been saying this for a long time. In 2008, at the NATO summit in Bucharest, he told then President George W. Bush, when he kind of opened the door of NATO to Georgia and Ukraine, Putin said to him at the time, we know this, he said, "George, what are you doing? Ukraine is not a real country." And a lot of people of his generation, the people who grew up in the Dvor, believe that. They still can't get used to the idea that it's a separate country. You heard Zolotov, the guy sitting back there in the striped shirt, who used to be his bodyguard, who just looks like he rolled in from the local pub where he's been drinking and sharing conspiracy theories with his buddies, and is now like a very high-ranking Silavik in Russia, you heard him say, Russia doesn't have a border with Ukraine. The West imposes border. So they've all been like, they all sit there and they talk about this. They believe this. They're like, and a lot of this emerged out of the isolation of COVID. And, I joke that, during COVID, a bunch of us bought a bunch of shit we didn't need on Amazon, and Putin cooked up this plan to make a Slavic ethno-state,
Well, and he kept his distance while he did it.
Oh, with this.
Well, he just always kept a lot of feet away from everybody, it seemed.
Well, because during the COVID pandemic, he was the only one he made Russians go back to work after a lockdown of a couple weeks. And he said, unlike the West, we don't have a rich auntie who's going to come and save us. So everybody has to go back to work. But he made people go through this weird tunnel where they get spritzed with some kind of, I don't know, Lysol. And everybody who had a meeting with him had to isolate for 2 weeks in a special hotel that was staffed by the FSO, which is the Russian Secret Service. And it was heads of corporations, ministers in his cabinet, presidents of other countries. They had to go and live in this hotel alone in a room for 2 weeks, and they'd get their meals delivered to their door. And so he obviously didn't see a lot of people, because who has the time, right? If you're the president of, Kazakhstan. So
Isolation is
loopy.
bad. Let me open it up to questions. Who has, I know a lot of people do. Yes.
Oh, how do we explain Putin's high approval ratings? Well, when you live in a society where information is tightly controlled and you are scared, and people know that, so for example, in Russia in just the last year, an 18-year-old girl was sent to jail for wearing earrings with rainbows on them because they were seen to be LGBT propaganda, and the LGBT movement, the international LGBT movement, is now classified as an extremist terrorist organization on par with ISIS. A 72-year-old woman was given a 5-year sentence for reposting somebody else's posts on Facebook. Another woman was thrown in jail because her kind of away message on WhatsApp in Korean said no war. So people have gone to jail for their private conversations being overheard, for likes on Facebook, likes on Twitter. A 68-year-old pediatrician was just sent to jail because one of her patients said that she had insulted a war veteran in conversation with her. People are scared. People are really scared. I mean, the craziest story of all was a man who was a single father to a 12-year-old girl. The 12-year-old girl goes into school and in art class draws a little picture with, a sun and a tree and whatever, and it says, and she wrote, no to war. Within days, he had been arrested by the FSB, beaten, tortured. He lost his parental rights. He's now in jail. He got a 2.5-year sentence, and she is no longer legally his daughter and lives in an orphanage. So people know that, right? You do a couple of those things. You don't have to do that to everybody, but people immediately, to our earlier point, people immediately are like, okay, it's a different ballgame. I'm going to shut up. And so then when somebody calls you, a pollster calls you and says, hi, you don't know me from Adam, but do you approve of the job that the president is doing? What are you going to say?
Yes. So the question is
in the Far East, like near China, yeah.
Possibility of the eastern provinces of Russia, you said?
Yeah.
Trying to secede.
Like in Asia, essentially. I think that's always been a fear of the Kremlin's, but I don't see it happening anytime soon.
Yes.
So that's been the worry, and that's been the worry of the Biden administration in sending this or that weapon system or allowing Ukrainians to use American weapons deeper in Russian territory, right? This fear of escalation, as if the Russians are scared of escalation. Like, they don't need a reason to escalate. They never do, and Ukrainians joke, they're like, what's he going to do, invade Ukraine? But yes, they have a very different nuclear doctrine than we do, and they love to point that out to us. And they, unlike us, allow for preemptive nuclear strikes. What's more is, for the last few years, they've been kind of lowering the threshold, including in the minds of their people, of, what's a tactical nuke? Not a big deal. So it'll take out a few city blocks, spread some, kill a few thousand people, spread some radiation, but really kind of bupkis when you think about it, right? And I think that would be, I think, the more likely scenario, and I think they correctly see it as that is not something that would lead to all-out nuclear war. If they use a tactical nuke, which they like to point out is really small, if they use it on the battlefield in Ukraine, or they use it on Kiev or another Ukrainian city, the U.S. is going to nuke Moscow and risk getting nuked back? Probably not. And I think that's been where it's not the threat of all-out nuclear war, it's that. And what happens if they do that, right? If they set that precedent, because that's never been done. And what example does it show to China, to India, to Pakistan, and to other nuclear powers? Because that opens up a whole new can of worms, and the administration, the Biden administration, has been grappling with that and trying to use China and India to lean on Russia, to tell Russia that, like, hey, if you do this, we will destroy your entire Navy, for example, or we will go in and destroy every single soldier you have in Ukraine, or we will perhaps conduct a massive conventional strike deep inside Russian territory.
The we being who again?
The West.
Just
right?
the West generally.
Yeah, because there needs to be some kind of deterrent there, right? Because when you go to the big nukes, like, that in and of itself is the deterrent, right? Because you respond and everybody's dead within like 10 minutes.
Well, this has been the debate for many, many decades.
Well, but this is a different debate. This is about little nukes. This is about tactical nukes that would take out a few city blocks, would kill maybe 10,000 people, and it's not enough for the West to risk its own nuclear annihilation to retaliate with nukes, right? But once you allow that, that means then everybody can do that in every future war, and you don't want to open that precedent, or set that precedent and open that door. So that's kind of where we are, and Russians have been very, the Russian government, the Russian propaganda machine, have been very steadily kind of chipping away at the kind of moral fences around that. Like, it wouldn't be so bad.
Just getting people acclimated.
Yeah, it wouldn't be so bad. I remember I wrote a piece for Puck, and
just say once again, Julia is a founding partner at Puck News.
With Bill Cohen. Who just left.
Did he leave? I was going to give him such a shout out, but he go.
Anyway, but about this, about how inside the White House, in the Biden administration, people had kind of realized that a lot of this was just saber rattling, and that they weren't going to do this, and nobody really thought it's true. I think in November they got pretty close. In November 2022, when Russians were kind of retreating all over the front and lost Kherson in the south, there was a fear that they were getting close to using a nuke. But now nobody really thinks that in the Biden administration, and they think that it's just scare tactics. I got a bunch of calls from Moscow then, and they even did a whole show on Russian state TV about that article, because
about your article.
Yeah, they got very upset. They were like, "You don't respect us anymore. We will use a nuke." We don't want you to relax.
Can I just tell you something that's so fascinating? Because to prepare for this, I reread an article I had read in college that some of you might be familiar with in Foreign Affairs. It was the George Kennan article. It was written anonymously at the time, X, and it was the containment doctrine. And one of the things he warned about is whatever you do with this Soviet nation, it was called the roots of Soviet behavior, right? Whatever you do, be sensitive to the prestige factor. Do not do anything that erodes their sense of prestige. And this is exactly what you're talking about. You were in some ways eroding their prestige, and they did a whole show on it.
Well, it wasn't eroding the prestige. It was eroding the fear, right? I think Putin thought he could get the West to love him, and then he realized he couldn't, so he'd get the West to fear him, right? And fear is, in his mind, is a type of respect. And so if we don't fear him as much, then we don't respect him. And that also goes back not just to the Kennan article, but also just like the street mentality. My partner and I are rewatching The Sopranos now. Like, so much of it is about respect and how you show respect. And if you don't respect me, that is, very possibly a cardinal sin. And so the reason they did a show about this article was because they didn't want Americans, as if we're watching their stupid TV shows, we're not, but they didn't want us to think that they weren't capable anymore, that they wouldn't do this. They want us to be scared because that is a form of respect.
So let me ask you a final question then, because you shared with me when I picked you up at the airport that you are pregnant. So we can... we don't want to that's a little superstitious thing. We don't want to applaud yet, but you are but to think now about bringing a child into the world, you and your partner. You're watching The Sopranos. I'm not sure that's like good TV for your child, but the question is, as you envision being a mother, like, what would you tell your child about this world that they are entering, given what you know and what you've experienced and what your family has been through?
Man, that is the hardest question you've asked me so far. And now, well, first of all, I'm still wrapping my head around the fact that it's a boy. And I don't know what I'm going to do with him, because I was not prepared for that possibility. But I think one of the challenges is, and luckily he'll have good role models in his father and in my father, of what it's like to be somebody who's a strong man, but also kind of at their core, without even thinking about it, a feminist. Somebody who is not threatened by strong women, who understands that a strong man gravitates towards strong women, and they don't emasculate him. If anything, they show how strong he is. But I think what I would try to impart on this kid is that the world is a really dark place. People are, as my friend David Frum says, monkeys in pants. And we do a lot of dark monkey shit, like we start wars over stupid things. We are violent, we are cynical, we are terrible, but in that, there's still so much joy and pleasure in the world and in life. And I think this is where a lot of my American audiences don't understand me, and they think that I'm, my newsletter for Puck used to be called Tomorrow Will Be Worse, which has a story behind it. But I've found that Americans often get almost offended when I kind of lay out, like, here's probably what's going to happen, here's the analysis, and they get almost offended that it's not optimistic. They're like, I want optimism, or this is not inspiring. And I'm like, I'm just telling you what is, right? Because I come from a place where history was not inspiring. It was terrifying. It was crushing.
And you live with that, though, side by side with joy, because I will say, last thing, you wrote a beautiful piece a number of years ago on what you call your lucky accident. The fact that you wound up in the United States, you considered, and you and many fellow refugees considered to be the best accident that could have ever happened to you.
Totally, yeah. But again, there's, I think, what my in-laws, who are just so American and so, they're so positive and so relentlessly optimistic, because they're not Ashkenazi Jews, where, I remember I was interviewing Deborah Lipstadt, who's Biden's special envoy for combating global anti-Semitism, and she said, the optimists didn't make it among us, right? Optimism was dangerous for where we came from. Whereas I think for Americans, optimism and positive thinking pays off usually and is rewarded. But I think what my in-laws are often surprised by when they interact with me or my parents, my relatives, is that there is both this kind of constant awareness of the suffering in the world, of the darkness, of the danger, of all the things that can go wrong, all the illnesses you might catch, but that, the joy that, you plan for the worst, but when it doesn't happen, that happiness, the joy of the lightness of not experiencing those things, of being, I still, the little things that can bring so much joy. I'm not being coherent. I did not expect this question. But for example, I
hope you didn't expect the other ones. Oh.
No. But I'm used to talking about Russia. I'm not used to talking about how to raise a child. I've never had one. But my parents, for example, they grew up behind the Iron Curtain. They left when they were 30. And my mom went to a French school and is fluent in French. And during the 1980 Moscow Olympics, she was somehow allowed to give tours to French visitors in French. And they said, wow, your French is so good. Your accent is so good. Where in France did you study? And she's like, I've never left the Soviet Union, Iron Curtain. And now they travel all the time. They have a massive wine collection. Whenever I go to their, not now obviously, but whenever I go to their house for dinner, we go downstairs to their basement, and it's like, what should we have with dinner? And it's just like walls and walls and walls of wine and that they've accumulated in their travels. And I was like, stop. And she's, focused on this Pinot Noir or this GSM. I'm like, if somebody went back, 35 years and told you living in Moscow and, Soviet Moscow, that you would be traveling the world, that one of your daughters would be running around on planes with the head of the American military, and that you'd have this extensive wine collection that you accumulated in your travels, would you have believed them? And she's just like, anyway, so what do we have for dinner? And I think the key is just to remember, where we've come from, how hard it was, and to be like, it's not that hard anymore. I don't know. It's very simple.
I'm so glad I asked you that last question because now
you like the rambling.
No, because now you are prepared to have a child. So, Julia Ioffe, thank you so much.